Inside ADX Florence, America's toughest prison. A Life Behind Bars documentary. There is a prison in the United States designed for a very specific purpose. Not to rehabilitate. Not to prepare inmates for release. But to permanently contain people the system believes it cannot afford to lose control over. This prison does not rely on chaos, violence, or constant force. It relies on silence, distance, and isolation measured in decades. This is ADX Florence, the most restrictive prison in the American federal system. Before we go any further, if you value deeply researched, factual documentaries about the justice system, consider subscribing to Life Behind Bars. Your support helps us continue producing long-form, in-depth stories like this one. The prison of last resort. ADX Florence is not where federal inmates begin their sentence. It is where they are sent after the system decides every other option has failed. Within the Federal Bureau of Prisons, ADX serves a single role: a final destination for inmates considered too dangerous, too disruptive, or too influential to be housed anywhere else. Federal officials have repeatedly described the facility as a prison built for control, not correction. That distinction defines everything about how it operates. Why maximum security wasn't enough. Before ADX Florence existed, the federal system relied on traditional maximum security prisons. These facilities allowed group movement, communal recreation, shared dining, limited inmate interaction. By the late 1980s, internal reviews revealed a growing problem. A small number of inmates continued to exert control despite incarceration. Some organized violence inside prison walls. Others coordinated criminal activity across institutions. Some maintained authority over gangs or extremist networks beyond the prison entirely. The system was containing bodies, but not behavior. The inmates who forced a new kind of prison. ADX Florence was not built in theory. It was built in response. Federal records show that a small group of inmates repeatedly exposed the limits of existing prison design. These were individuals who assaulted staff repeatedly, directed violence from inside cells, maintained influence even under strict supervision. Traditional solutions failed. ADX Florence was created to remove opportunity itself. What too dangerous really means. The phrase too dangerous does not describe a single behavior. Within federal policy, it reflects a pattern, documented over time. That pattern may include repeated violent conduct, leadership within criminal or extremist organizations, demonstrated escape risk, influence that persists despite incarceration, national security concerns. In most cases, no single incident triggers transfer to ADX Florence. It is the accumulation of risk. A decision made without a courtroom. No judge sentences an inmate to ADX Florence. The decision is administrative. A review panel within the Bureau of Prisons evaluates an inmate's history, behavior, and security profile. If officials determine that no other facility can safely manage the inmate, the transfer is approved. Federal courts have consistently ruled that this authority lies with prison administrators, not sentencing judges. Arrival at ADX Florence. Arrival at ADX Florence is controlled and quiet. Inmates are processed individually. Movement is minimal. Interaction is limited. From the moment the cell door closes, the environment changes completely. For many inmates, it marks the most restrictive conditions they have ever experienced. Architecture designed for isolation. ADX Florence does not rely on bars and open cell blocks. It relies on architecture. The prison is divided into small, self-contained units designed to eliminate inmate-to-inmate contact. Paths never intersect. Movement is choreographed. Even brief encounters are prevented by design. The building itself enforces isolation. The cell is a control environment. Each cell measures roughly 7 by 12 feet. Inside, everything is fixed in place. The narrow window is angled so inmates cannot see other prisoners, and often cannot see the surrounding world. Nothing in the cell can be moved. Nothing can be dismantled. The cell is not just living space. It is the primary control mechanism. Why communication is restricted. For many inmates at ADX Florence, the primary concern is not physical violence. It is communication. Federal officials have argued that some inmates retain influence even while incarcerated, through ideology, reputation, or organizational authority. ADX Florence restricts communication to prevent inmates from directing actions beyond prison walls. Every call, letter, and visit is regulated. In some cases, communication is reduced to the legal minimum. National security and extreme containment. Some inmates arrive at ADX Florence not because of violence inside prison walls, but because of what federal officials believe they could still do beyond them. National security cases occupy a unique space within the federal prison system. In these cases, the primary concern is not escape or physical assault, but influence. The possibility that communication alone could inspire violence, coordinate criminal activity, or reinforce extremist networks. For these inmates, isolation is treated as a preventative measure. When ideology is seen as a threat, federal filings in national security cases often emphasize ideology rather than behavior. The concern is that certain individuals retain symbolic power, that their words, even from inside a cell, could motivate others. Courts have repeatedly acknowledged this reasoning, allowing prison administrators broad authority to restrict communication when national security is cited. These decisions are controversial but legally supported. Special administrative measures. For some inmates, placement at ADX Florence is only part of the restriction. They are also placed under special administrative measures, commonly referred to as SAMs. These measures are authorized by the U.S. Attorney General and reviewed annually. SAMs can severely limit phone calls, written correspondence, media contact, messages sent through third parties. In extreme cases, even communication with legal counsel is subject to additional monitoring under strict guidelines. These measures are among the most restrictive in the U.S. prison system. Daily life without variation. Life inside ADX Florence is defined by predictability. Lights turn on at the same time each day. Meals arrive on a rigid schedule. Movement occurs only when authorized. This structure is intentional. By removing unpredictability, the prison removes opportunities for coordination, resistance, or manipulation. For inmates, it also changes how time is experienced. Days blend together. Weeks lose distinction. Years pass without markers. Meals in total isolation. Meals at ADX Florence are eaten alone. There is no dining hall. No shared tables. No conversation. Food is delivered through a slot in the door and retrieved the same way. According to federal policy, this eliminates opportunities for violence and contraband exchange. Critics argue it also removes one of the last remaining social rituals of daily life. Recreation without a yard. Inmates are permitted limited recreation time each week. Recreation does not mean a traditional yard. Instead, inmates are escorted, alone, to small, enclosed concrete pens. These spaces are designed to prevent visual or verbal contact with other inmates. Exercise occurs under constant surveillance. Silence dominates. The role of silence. Silence at ADX Florence is not accidental. It is a management tool. The absence of noise reduces stimulation, communication, and emotional escalation. Former inmates have described the environment as unnervingly quiet, broken only by mechanical sounds. Psychologists note that prolonged silence can heighten internal stress, even without physical threat. Mental health monitoring. ADX Florence maintains on-site medical and mental health services. Inmates receive periodic evaluations, and treatment plans are documented. Federal officials state that mental health care is available and ongoing. Mental health experts counter that monitoring alone does not eliminate the psychological risks associated with prolonged isolation. This disagreement has been central to multiple legal challenges. What research says about long-term isolation? Decades of research on solitary confinement have identified recurring psychological effects. These include anxiety and depression, difficulty concentrating, memory impairment, distorted perception of time. Not every individual experiences these effects in the same way, but risk increases with duration and severity of isolation. This finding appears consistently across peer-reviewed studies. Adaptation or deterioration. Some inmates adapt to extreme isolation. They develop rigid routines, exercise in confined spaces, read or write extensively. Others experience significant psychological decline. Pre-existing mental health conditions, length of confinement, and individual coping mechanisms all play a role. There is no uniform outcome. Legal challenges from inside the most restrictive prison. ADX Florence has been the subject of multiple legal challenges since it opened. Inmates have argued that the conditions inside the prison violate constitutional protections, particularly the prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Courts have examined claims related to prolonged isolation, access to mental health care, and due process. In most cases, judges have deferred to prison administrators, citing the unique security concerns posed by the inmate population housed at ADX Florence. The prevailing legal view is that extreme conditions alone do not constitute unconstitutional punishment if they are tied to legitimate security objectives. Why courts defer to prison officials? Federal courts have repeatedly emphasized that prison administrators are better positioned than judges to assess security risks. This principle, known as administrative deference, plays a central role in ADX-related rulings. Judges typically avoid second-guessing decisions involving inmate classification, housing assignments, and communication restrictions. As long as the Bureau of Prisons can demonstrate a rational connection between restrictions and security concerns, courts are unlikely to intervene. This legal framework has allowed ADX Florence to operate largely unchanged for decades. The step-down program, a path that exists on paper. Officially, ADX Florence is not intended to be permanent for every inmate. The Bureau of Prisons operates a step-down program designed to gradually transition inmates to less restrictive conditions. Progression through the program requires sustained compliance, psychological evaluations, and approval at multiple administrative levels. Each stage offers small increases in out-of-cell time and limited social interaction. In theory, the program provides a way out of the most extreme isolation. Why progression is rare. In practice, advancement through the step-down program is uncommon. Many inmates remain at ADX Florence for years or decades. Factors that limit progression include the severity of the original offense, ongoing security assessments, national security designations, placement under special administrative measures, psychological evaluations that do not support transfer. In some cases, inmates complete their entire federal sentence at ADX Florence without ever leaving the facility. How ADX Florence compares to other supermax prisons. Several states operate supermax prisons, but ADX Florence occupies a distinct position within the federal system. Compared to other facilities, ADX Florence typically involves greater levels of isolation, smaller recreation spaces, more restrictive communication policies, higher use of administrative segregation. Correctional experts widely regard ADX Florence as the most restrictive prison in the United States. This reputation is central to both its perceived necessity and its controversy. Does the model achieve its goals? Supporters of ADX Florence point to one key outcome: control. Within the facility, inmate-on-inmate violence is rare. Opportunities for coordinated assaults or organized activity are almost entirely eliminated. Critics argue that this control is achieved through extreme deprivation rather than rehabilitation. The debate is not about effectiveness in limiting behavior, but about the long-term human and ethical cost of doing so. The ethical question at the center. ADX Florence forces a difficult ethical question. How far should a system go to prevent harm? Federal officials argue that the prison protects lives, both inside and outside prison walls. Critics argue that prolonged isolation may inflict psychological harm that cannot be fully justified by security concerns. There is no consensus, only trade-offs. When control becomes permanent. For some inmates, ADX Florence becomes a permanent environment. Years pass without meaningful change. Conditions remain constant. The outside world becomes abstract. Time, rather than punishment, becomes the defining experience. Why ADX Florence still exists. More than 3 decades after it opened, ADX Florence remains fully operational. It has survived legal challenges, public criticism, and shifting attitudes toward incarceration. The reason is not tradition. It is necessity, at least as defined by the federal system. Officials argue that a small number of inmates cannot be safely housed anywhere else. Not in maximum security prisons. Not in segregation units. Not under standard controls. ADX Florence exists because no alternative has proven capable of managing the same level of risk. The absence of a replacement. Over the years, policymakers have discussed reform. Some restrictions have been adjusted. Mental health oversight has increased. Step-down procedures have been refined. But the core model has remained intact. There is no facility waiting to replace ADX Florence. As long as the system encounters inmates it considers uncontainable elsewhere, ADX remains the final option. A prison built for exceptional cases. Federal officials emphasized that ADX Florence was never intended to be a standard prison. It was designed for exceptional cases. The population housed there represents a fraction of the federal inmate population, selected through layers of review and classification. Supporters argue that judging ADX by ordinary prison standards misses its purpose. Critics argue that no exception should permit indefinite isolation. Both perspectives continue to coexist, unresolved. What life becomes in total containment. Inside ADX Florence, life is not measured by events. It is measured by routine. Meals arrive. Lights change. Recreation comes and goes. Years pass without milestones. For inmates held under these conditions, the experience of time fundamentally changes. The future becomes abstract. The past fades. The present repeats. Security achieved, at a cost. By nearly every operational metric, ADX Florence achieves its primary goal. Violence is minimal. Coordination is prevented. Control is absolute. The cost of that control is harder to quantify. It appears in legal filings, psychological evaluations, and decades of debate over how far a system should go to maintain order. ADX Florence stands as proof that total containment is possible. Whether it should be permanent remains the unresolved question. What this prison represents. ADX Florence represents the outer edge of incarceration in the United States. A place where security outweighs social interaction. Where isolation replaces movement. Where prevention takes precedence over rehabilitation. It is not a model applied broadly. It is a line drawn, deliberately, at the far end of the system. ADX Florence is often described as the most extreme prison in America. But it is not the only place where incarceration has been pushed to its limits. Across the country, other prisons adopted similar philosophies of total control, and some of them collapsed under the weight of their own design. In the next documentary, we examine what happens when prisons built for absolute control lose it, and the consequences that follow. ADX Florence was built to solve a problem the system believed had no other answer. It was not designed to offer redemption. It was not designed to restore. It was designed to contain. For decades, this prison has existed at the furthest edge of incarceration, where security becomes absolute and isolation becomes the defining condition of life. For some, it represents protection. For others, it represents a warning about how far control can go when fear of risk outweighs every other consideration. What ADX Florence ultimately forces us to confront is not just the nature of punishment, but the limits of the system itself. Where does safety end, and where does something else begin? Thank you for watching Life Behind Bars. If you found this documentary valuable, consider subscribing. Your support allows us to continue producing long-form, factual stories about the justice system that are rarely seen and rarely understood.